Well, hello, and thanks for joining me today. I'm having a dojo moment, like a little bit of a sit down, and these are one of the things that's very hard to recreate with an online kind of teaching thing. Even if you're doing it live with a Zoom or something like that, the moments where you sit down and, as Wang Shangjai says, discuss the nitty gritty with your teacher. So that's what I want to try and recreate a little bit. So get a brew and sit down, spend an hour with me, and we're going to discuss some stuff, and hopefully it's going to be interesting. And as ever, it might disappoint you because it will disappoint some of your expectations and some of the ways that you think about things. But at the end of the day, each one's about the rebellion. It's about revolutionizing. It's about being innovative, critical, radical, and finding that space somewhere between where the traditional methods of Chinese wushu just aren't working for you, or you've reached the boundaries of that method. There's people in Chinese martial arts like that, and then you think, well, what are the alternatives like? There's this over here where people are pretending to have magic powers, and then there's this over here where people are doing something completely different, like BJJ, MMA, and saying, I use the principles of Chinese wushu, but really like the people who do BJJ and MMA, who didn't do Chinese martial arts, they can do all the same things as you, so why would you waste all this time doing all of that? And somewhere between all of that, there's kind of a space for each one to be something different. And that's hopefully the kind of people who are following along with the Yiquan method, because that's the kind of people who are going to benefit from it most. People who are looking for something. They've not given up on the Chinese martial arts concept, but they've not been perverted by this magic power nonsense, and they've not just given up one way or another and gone and done something else. So, or even worse, trying to hold on to something that they can exploit financially from this Chinese martial arts thing, but then moving on into doing something else, which is kind of a fad at the moment. I was looking at, well, there's a few people, very advanced practitioners in Chen Tai Chi, when you watch them doing push hands, and you can see exactly that. They've reached the limits of Chen Tai Chi in terms of the push hands format. Like, you can't get any better within that format. But if they stay within those boundaries, that's it. I mean, you're never going to get better. That's like, for example, the kind of push hands, Chen Tai Chi push hands. As long as you hold on to the idea of Chen Tai Chi push hands, there's just something about the format itself that stops you from, well, it's almost conceptual, that this kind of schizophrenia around, well, it's not wrestling, it's not a competitive wrestling format, and yet it is, but it's also push hands, and like, well, where's the point where you can evolve beyond that? And if you do evolve beyond that, then you suddenly step into a different world where, like, Greco-Roman wrestlers aren't going to play that game. They're not going to be stood with you chest to chest. And if you just like make your body go very heavy and lean on a BJJ person, they're going to take your legs out from under you and so on, and you're going to open up into an entirely different world, and you're going to be disappointed because even those very elite level Chen Tai Chi people are suddenly not going to be able to make that work. So the belief that they could is going to be disappointed, but it opens up an entirely new vista where you can kind of let go of that push hands format and start really thinking about how do you bring their outstanding quintessence movement skills into a much more modernized wrestling format. And it's interesting because wrestlers tell them that, but there's so much pushback on that because people want to, there's this other group of people who just don't want to expand beyond this paradigm. Wrestlers are saying things like, well, yeah, if you see push hands, like Tai Chi push hands competition, very often people end up chest to chest, whereas wrestlers very often won't want to stay in that position because it's too weak. you can easily be, you know, it's whoever just like kicks your leg out from under you, you know, if they know what they're doing, or it's whoever moves first. So elite wrestlers will not do that, you know, they won't start off Chen Tai Chi or any kind of Tai Chi push-ons. You tend to end up chest to chest very quickly. And most wrestlers don't do that, so we expand beyond those boundaries, and that's very much a metaphor for Yiquan itself, that quintessence movement skills, but don't be caught up within the boundaries of that. So there's a place for people who are thinking like that. Quintessence movement skills, they're really valuable. How do we transition them over in a way that has to go beyond the boundaries of a traditional training format? And a lot of that's about belief and ideology. And at what point does it stop becoming Chen Tai Chi, for example, or any kind of Tai Chi? I'm just, you know, because I haven't practiced any other kind of Tai Chi other than Chen Tai Chi, so that's the way I think about Tai Chi. What's the point where you go beyond the boundaries of that and it's no longer Chen Tai Chi? And you have to disappoint that expectation that you belong to this thing that gives you your identity. And can you do that? So I met an old friend who does Chen Tai Chi, and we were kind of discussing this kind of thing, and it made me think about that a lot. And it's a good example of what Yiquan in its best form is trying to get at, that there's something beyond that you can go beyond those boundaries, that you can take the quintessence movement principles, and that's what really matters, and then apply them in different formats and also evolve and grow, because in each one there shouldn't be any boundaries. Then how do you do that? Once you've decided that you want to occupy this space, this kind of space that each one creates for you, where you bring in what's great from over here, but you're forward facing towards what's over here. How do you do that? And one of the ways is through conceptualization, through thinking about it, and not getting caught in the trap of pathologized conceptualization. So a lot of what people talk about as conceptualization, or, you know, they think they're talking about stuff with their teacher, but it's mostly just about their teacher's got some insecurity about someone else or something like that, and then that just spews out into the discussions and corrupts it. So it's very hard to recreate that. And one of those insecurities that spills out and corrupts it is attacking the idea of conceptualization itself. So you've got another group of people who tell you, don't think about it too much. And I think if you're in a group, that's usually problematic anyway. And a group where people are wearing robes is significantly more problematic. You know, classes where you're wearing uniforms and you start creating a group identity and groupthink, that kind of thing. Just it's got negative trajectories that you've got to be careful of. And then when people start saying don't think, when your group leader starts telling you not to think, like Zhao Daoxin says, that's the time to get out, you know. And it's also why Wang Shenjai really, it's one of the reasons why he says like this traditional master-disciple relationship is really negative for growth. And so, you know, here's the first thing you kind of got to disappoint within each one, because most each one people have recreated this process directly contrary, not only to Wang Shenjai's advice, but directly contrary to Wang Shenjai's reasoning, which is actually sound. You know, like it doesn't. The idea is that this kind of master-student relationship is a conduit for preserving quality. Doesn't work, you know, it empirically doesn't work, it hasn't worked. But the problem is it creates a system, like Wang Shenjai says, it creates a system where you don't feel like you can you can't contradict the teacher. You can't discuss things with the teacher. You can't ask questions of the teacher. And of course, when Wang Shenjai is talking about this, he's talking about a culture where it's taboo to question the teacher anyway. So it's a significantly bigger deal for Wang Shenjai talking about Chinese culture than it might be, for example, for me talking about. So, I mean, there's no such thing as one Chinese culture, there's no such thing as one Western culture, but this thing about questioning. I need to think about that, because I have to say, like, someone who's brought up as Catholic, I was brought up in that environment where you couldn't question doctrine. So of course it is part of Western culture. It's just where you find it. Western culture, so called, like, as a social scientist, I can tell you, like, what is culture is a very complex thing, and the idea of one Western culture is a political construction. It's a very complex concept. But it's an absolute fact. For example, like, because I remember our coach telling us, like, it was such a different thing for us to be asking questions. What's this for? How do you do that? Is this right? Because what about this? And being very open-minded, he's like, actually, he thought it was a positive thing, and he's saying, like, well, in China you can't do that. You just can't. You don't question like that. And actually, there's positives to that as well, because some abstract concepts you can't just get straight away. So you kind of have to trust that you're not going to get the reason why you're doing this thing until later on. There is a way around that, I have to say, and that's that the coach can demonstrate what they're talking about. So I saw something that I did that thing then, where you take too big a sip and the tea goes right over your lip, big wet mouth. I saw someone who'd written something where what they were saying was that people who are interested in fight training aren't interested in doing standing pole. They're not interested in the Yiquan method. And what he was saying was, well, it's very difficult to promote Yiquan because people won't, as a fighting concept, as an actual martial arts, which is its essential purpose. It's very difficult to promote it because it doesn't attract the people who are interested in fight training. And I had a bit of a problem with the way it was written, if I'm honest, because it seemed to be blaming those people. It seemed to be blaming the students, because it was saying that the students who do practice Yiquan won't do fight training. So it's attracting a certain group of people. And yeah, there's some, there's truth to that Yiquan and Tai Chi isn't necessarily, certainly outside of China, isn't necessarily attracting people who are interested in fight training. They've got other options where they can see the relationship between the work you put in and the outcome much more clearly. And I did write a little bit of a response to that, which, no, very few people listen to what I say, which is fair enough. And my response essentially is, no, people who are interested in fight training would do standing if they could see outcomes from it. So there's no reality where people who are practicing serious MMA are lazy about physical training. There's no reality where that's happening, so that's not true. What is true is they can't see the outcomes. They can't see, here's someone talking about standing, and here's someone talking a really big game about each one, and here's them demonstrating what they're talking about. They can't see that. So why would they? If you could demonstrate, if the person who's written this article can say, look, here's me doing standing, here's me doing sparring, here's the connection, here's why this will help you. And if that matched the claims that people are making about Yiquan, which are often very overblown, then people will be queuing up to do it from MMA and other, much more straightforwardly fight-based martial arts. That's the reality. So if they're not seeing the outcomes. So there is, you're having a grumble. Anyway, whatever it was that I was talking about, I've forgotten about my train of thought. So I'll come back to the idea that concepts are very important, and discussing concepts and using those to kind of unfold your understanding, and seeing each one as something completely different then. So there's another way of doing it, and that's that you just create a carbon copy of someone else. And this is one of the things that Wang Shenjai was trying to get away from, that you copy someone else's form and you try and copy it exactly, and you create generations of clones like that. And that's been taken into a new degree, I have to say. Recently something's emerged where we're seeing people, they've got photographs from the past, like someone, famous Tai Chi person, famous Shinny person, or even a drawing or something like that, and then putting that next to them, a photo of that next to themselves in exactly the same pose, to indicate the perfection of their lineal descent and their understanding of the system. And this is also passed over a little bit into Yiquan. I saw someone the other day who they posted a photo, someone trying to promote, they've set up a school that they, like their understanding of Yiquan. I mean, you've got to be careful, it's just a word, isn't it? I had a very famous Yiquan so-called instructor contacted me and kind of wanted to be friends, and I just said in the end, like morally and ethically, because it's one of these kind of no-touch, fly-away people, and I just said, look, we both use the term Yiquan, but we both mean very different things by it. So, it's like you say apple, but it's a banana, so we can't, have any kind of connection. So it's someone who's, they've set up a school and it's their what they call Yiquan, which is fair enough, it's not a copyrighted word. Shaolin Temple tried to copyright the term Shaolin, which is quite interesting. What would have happened then? It's not a copyrighted term, so people can use it, but he posted a photograph of himself in a pose and then juxtaposed that with a photograph of Yao Zongzun in the same or similar pose. And the idea was, look how perfect my Yiquan, it's perfectly exactly the same as Yao Zongzun's. And a couple of interesting things around that. One is that of all people, Yao Zongzun said that's ridiculous. Actually, it's a special case of when Wang Shenjai said don't train in mirrors, don't fetishize the physical shape. But Yao Zongzun said, like he specifically says, it's ridiculous to do that kind of thing, like to fetishize the exact form, and he kind of laughs at people who, well, he doesn't laugh, but he says it's ridiculous if you try to copy the form exactly, like you've got to have a bit of an abstract leap to recognize that it's the quality of the movement. But secondly, you could see even from a photograph that there's significant difference. Like, I wouldn't have believed it, but when you see the photograph side by side, you can see that Yao Zongzun's posture is, just from the way that the muscles are flexed and the way that his body is structured, you can see that it's significantly higher level, and that this other person might be superficially doing that posture, but it's not the same. And in fact, like, you could see even from a photograph that he didn't have whole body structural interconnectivity. And I wouldn't, until I'd seen that, I wouldn't have thought it was possible to judge from a photograph like that. But Kenichi Sawai, one of Wang Shanjai's students, did say you can learn from a photograph. I thought that was a special case of that, isn't it? It's quite interesting. So it's a thing that people are doing where we can really learn from that, because it's the total opposite. If you think about Wang Shanjai talking about traditional wushu, and like getting away from this idea of copying the posture exactly, and then juxtapose that with, well, what is it Wang Shanjai's trying to get at? And it's something totally different. So like creating like independent wushu, we don't even want to say experts or masters, we want to say like practitioners, but something like going on a journey from doing an undergraduate degree through to PhD, where you become like an individual scholar of wushu, an individual representative of your own practice. Something wonderful, something innovative, something where you take it further. And yeah, okay, the teacher is there to save you from reinventing the wheel. There are things around posture that you need to learn, obviously, and there's different ways of learning. And some things are important, I have to say, around, like, some things that you wouldn't think are necessarily important. Like, actually, standing's a really serious, it's a really serious exercise. You hold your arm out for like 3/4 of an hour or an hour, things start happening in your arm and neurological things start happening. And a very good example is like some people, like I get this, and I think Wang Shenjai had this, like most of Wang Shenjai students, if you see them doing standing, they have this big kind of open posture like this with their hand, with their thumb out like that. Han Xing Chao, for example, has it like that, and he's probably the most orthodox, we'll talk about in a moment. And Wang Shenjai doesn't. He usually has his thumb like that, what we call tiger mouth posture. And Yu Yongyan points this out, that Wang Shenjai does that. And one of the reasons for that is, like, I got this, like I started getting like a neurological condition where my thumb started shaking or vibrating, but not like when I do vibration. When I do vibration skill, that's a different thing. They started vibrating in a really negative way, like you get repetitive strain injury, and you know people who use it, one of them things for drilling the ground up, you know, and it was continuing constantly after doing standing, which, you know, as a musician, that's not helpful. But I couldn't even type or anything, so I had to really think about, well, why is that happening, you know. What cured it was like doing it the way Wang Shenjai does it, like tiger mouth posture. It cured that. It went away from doing that. So little micro things like that. That's what makes me think Wang Shenjai may have had that, because he also talks about things that were quite negative. Instead, like he talks about getting pains in his chest because the way he was leaning in Zhanzhuang posture, he was leaning forwards on the balls of his feet, and he started getting pains in his chest. And he had to change it to leaning backwards, and that also is important because it leads into something I think that's important that we need to talk about, which is training method and understanding that, you know, how much intuitive development Wang Shenjai did as opposed to learning from a teacher. So that was the main thing that I wanted to talk about, and I've been talking for half an hour. But that's, you know, when you have these kind of dojo chats, it's like, that's what you do. You shoot the breeze, and you get loads of insight, you know, from people who've been thinking a lot about it, if you're open to it. So the question is, how then do we, for Wang Shenjai, how do you recreate what he'd done? How do you create these people, these like kind of independent, radical-minded beings who are capable of thinking very dialectically, very contradictory thinking, challenging the status quo, exploring their intuitive skill, as opposed to recreating these clones, these people who want to do this, you know, who think that doing a posture exactly the same way as Yao Zhongzun is equivalent to Yao Zhongzun's skill. It's like the direct opposite of everything that we want to get across in Yiquan. And that's part of the problem with Yiquan. It's an abstract concept. How do you get that across? And that abstract concept also has to develop into real skill. How do you do that? So this is where curriculums started being developed, and Wang Shenjai starts developing a curriculum, and eventually we end up with this idea of the 7 stages of Yiquan. And this is the idea that, well, you'll begin with standing and you'll develop kind of an initial insight into Hun Yuan Li, which does just kind of happen naturally. It's not like a magical thing. Once you begin to understand what Hun Yuan Li is, then you understand why standing develops it. It's a very physical thing about when the body kind of hits the right kind of movement quality and you start moving, and all the metaphors that are used to describe it about, you know, being like a lump of lead or balls of lead. As you do micro movements, and you can feel like there's these balls of lead, and as you start moving, you start feeling the way the whole body moves as a structure, and then you start experiencing like how oppositional force works and so on. It's a very straightforward mechanical process, actually. It's nothing, not like these people who think like some magic power is downloaded into you, or, you know, these people who think like you're your tendons start elongating and this kind of stuff. It's like, come on. I saw someone, there's two people having an argument and they both kind of like, they're both in this category of absolute militant certainty that they are right, without any actual evidence of what, like, if you want to say you're on the right lines, you say, here I am doing it, I think this is along that's what I'm doing. I think I'm along the right lines, like, here I am doing it, I think this is along the right lines. But this absolute militant certainty, and they met head to head online, as always. Like, can you imagine if they met in person? It'd be like, you just know within like 10 seconds they'd be rolling about on the floor, and then 10 seconds later they'd both be so gassed, like they'd just like, you're not even worth it. One of them says, do you even know the secret Shaolin method of tendon elongation that was passed down from Dharma, that is the true heart of Yiquan? It's like, I think, listen, go and get counselling, because that's about a pathologized life world where you've created this. And I know as a fact, because I've seen this person saying other things, that they believe that they have magic powers and that Yiquan masters have magic powers, whether they call it that or not. Go and get counselling. You've enchanted your world pathologically to cope with feeling alienated and small and weak in a world that is very often horrifying and overpowering. It's also beautiful and wonderful, but the horrifying and overpowering forces are immense and they make people feel worthless. So you enchant your world to give it worth. So there's all those kinds of people who think it does that. Anyway, and then from there you start moving to kind of experience that feeling of the feelings that we're trying to get in the body. And we're very often misled because the metaphors that are used by Wang Shenjai and others create overblown expectations that we need to disappoint, because it's like, I need to get that feeling of like there's lead balls in my arms and I can't. And it's like, no, it's just that feeling that you've already got of resistance. That's it, that's all it was, And then as your whole body articulation starts improving and it feels like there's something there, even though like you're not tensing, it feels like there's weight and resistance and you're able to move these different parts of your body. They feel like there's lead balls and you feel, imagine that you're filled with lead balls and you're having to move, but you're doing it through relaxation rather than tension. Like, actually, that's quite an easy feeling to get out. It's not easy. It's easy, but it's not easy. It's hard, but it's not that hard, as Li Dongfeng says. You disappoint the expectation. You don't let the metaphor carry you away. Otherwise, you're like, oh, why can't I get this magical thing? Why won't my tendons elongate? And you let go of that, and it comes back down to earth. Anyway, and then you need some kind of resistance to that, because it's got to be practical. So you start maybe doing some kind of partner work. It could be push hands, or it could be something that we call push hands, but it's just like using the other person as a kind of piece of gym equipment in effect that gives you some kind of resistance. And then, step by step, you learn Farley, release of force. You learn how to use breath and vocalization. You start using Jian Wu, kind of martial or health dance. And finally, Sanshao. This is like the so-called seven stages of Yiquan. And I've seen someone say, actually, it was one of these people who was in this argument about, who is the true lineage, who's the true heir to the throne. It's like ending that feudal thing. A lot of people don't get, like, Wang Shenjai's vision was very close to, and in fact modelled on, the first emperor's vision of China. Like, if you don't know, the first emperor abolished the feudal system when China was initially unified, and instead of having, like, he belonged to a clan called the Ying clan. Instead of having Ying clan members take over the different domains as feudal lords, they instituted a more civic system, and that had always been the plan. It's always been the the Qin kings had prepared this political idea to do this, and there's enormous resistance to this. But this is like Wang Shanzhai saw it very much like this, like end this feudal system, reunite the elements of Wushu as one art, just like the first emperor reunited China as one culture, and replace this feudal system of masters and students with something based on competence. That's open to, and was of course open to corruption anyway, but you know, the idea is there. And so this guy anyway, he says like, you know, that's the 7 stages of Yiquan, and if you don't do that, then you can call it what you want, but you can't call it Yiquan. It's not Yiquan. And thanks Yiquan police for telling everyone else how to think, and also thanks Yiquan feudal overlord for restricting our growth and evolution. Because a couple of interesting things about that. Number one, Wang Shanzhai didn't learn Yiquan through the 7 stages of Yiquan, and neither did any of his students. And in fact, there's no case whatsoever where anyone did. None. If we want to talk about actual leading to, I mean, there's 2 things about that. One, leading to a level of competence that would match the level of overblown rhetoric that makes everyone else in the Chinese martial arts world roll their eyes at Yiquan people, because the bullshit rhetoric and claims of unbelievable competence. You know, you've got people, you think like what world do you live in? Like, you know, people like Liam Harrison or Naskawa Tenshin, you know, Chuck Liddell, anyone you can think of, like great MMA fighters, Conor McGregor, great boxers. These people are real, and their level is exceptionally high. And the way some people are talking about what each one does as a method is like, now we're so far beyond that. You can't even call that martial arts because they haven't developed, like, until you've developed the power of intuitive, you know, over what one person translates as mind force, the power of mind force. Until you've developed these skills, you can't even, I mean, Wang Shanzhai says things like, until you've kind of developed this, like, you can't even begin to talk about martial arts. And, you know, one of the things you've got to disappoint is like all these great fighters, like they might not have done it in quite the same way. It might not be quite the same outcome that Wang Shanzhai is talking about in terms of a structural movement quality. But their technical level is much higher anyway, so you're going to go and tell them that they can't talk about martial arts. You know, some like Yiquan people who like, all you've ever seen of them is them just going like this. And then talking about how absolutely amazing they are. So why is that 7 stages of each one there anyway? Like, the idea is to put some kind of structure on it, and that was always the problem with each one. How do you teach this thing? It's quite an abstract thing. And, you know, Wang Shanzhai says, like, you know, reject fixed methods, and the only fixed, you know, the worst fixed method of all is to have fixed methods. But this is a fixed method, and you can't get any more fixed than someone saying you have to do this, or otherwise it's not each one. And think about those 7 stages of each one anyway. Like the idea is to create these people that we want, these kind of like, they go through certain stages and eventually they're kind of like PhD scholars, and they're going to become professors, and they're going to have this level of competence. And by that, the idea is what we want is people who actually do stand strong in the world of fight-based martial arts, who are actually that level, who can demonstrate. And, you know, there's so many people who can't do that they've started to change the nature of each one itself. They started to change the definition of each one to say, well, you know, if you want to do that, go and do MMA, you know, go and do Thai boxing, like, because that's not what each one's about. Each one's about health or whatever, cultural experience, cultural consumption, Orientalism. Go and do that. But that's not how Wang Shanzhai thought about it. You know, he wanted to tour the world to promote this, you know, this thing that he believed that could radically change how we think about everything. And if that had gone ahead, things might have been very different, because that's what happened to is it Maeda, the founder of BJJ. I apologise if I've mispronounced that. The founder of BJJ, he went to America, went South America, North America, got exposed to catch wrestling, very much the kind of thing I was talking about earlier about Chen Tai Chi. He got exposed to catch wrestling and other kinds of martial arts, and there was no question he had to adapt. He had to adapt, he had to change, he had to create new ways of doing things. And you know, it could have been very different. You know, there's a very strong connection between BJJ and Yiquan that's quite historically interesting. That Kenichi Sawai was the student of Sampo Toku, who was Maeda's sparring partner, and Sampo Toku was considered to be higher level than Maeda anyway. So I've read anyway. He was considered to be a much more significant judo athlete. Kenichi Sawai was one of his top students, so there's this really interesting, got an itchy ear, this really interesting connection. So that's also about understanding each one as a social process, which is a whole other question, I suppose. That's why you've got to have space for growth, though. That's why you can't have a fixed way of thinking about each one. There's got to be space for growth. That thing that I talked about in Chen Tai Chi, when you, or any kind of traditional martial arts, you know, I'm not just picking on that. Wang Chen Tai sees it in every traditional martial art, that it reaches the limits of its growth, and usually that's through form. Like, why are we practicing those forms? Let's not spend so much time, if any, on forms. You can agree or disagree to the degree. You know, lots of and there's a reason why we might disagree, by the way, which is what I'm going to come to in a moment. Why we're going to spend so much time on forms when we could be spending that time, for example, learning new kinds of wrestling techniques and radically improve our level. You know, that might be an argument you could make about, for example, people who are absolutely outstanding at Chen Tai Chi push hands, but they've reached the boundaries. Maybe the next generation shouldn't spend so much time on forms. Maybe abolish that. This is Wang Shenjai's argument. Abolish all of that. You can get all these quintessence movement skills. You can get up to that level of push hands without doing forms, but you free up so much time. You can focus on the other half of the equation, which is fight training and practice. But how do you structure it? How do you structure the training? So they come up with the 7 stages, 8 if you want to include weapons training. There's various problems that occur around that. The major problem is, of course, it doesn't work. There's no case where it's worked. There's no case where we've produced someone that's like world leading, and you know, relative to the rest of the world in terms of actual ability, actual practical ability. There's various lies that are then rolled out to use that. Again, this is pathological. It's pathological discussion. So there's people who say, well, I've seen it online, you know, people saying, yeah, but there was loads of fights with gangsters in the 40s, the 50s, you know, it was proven then. Like, number one, that doesn't mean anything, you know, and number two, it didn't even happen. So, you know, there's loads of historical research done on that. The martial arts scene in China in those decades was heavily monitored. It was monitored during the Japanese occupation. It was talked about by newspapers. There's even, I found articles in the London Times, I think it was the Times, you know, talking about the fight scene in China, the challenge matches and all that. So it was like actually world famous. There's this story that, you know, Wang Shenjai had a fight with a Western boxer who then, a boxing champion who then wrote to the London Times, I'm telling you, I've got access to an academic database of all English language newspapers across all those decades. There isn't, I've searched and searched for it, so if you found it, let me know, but I couldn't find a trace of it. Not just in UK newspapers, all English language newspapers globally, there's no trace of it. So there's all these lies get rolled out, and then other people will be like anecdotal, like, well, you know, like I had a self-defense encounter, or I did boxing matches and I used the principles, and that comes back to the thing I was talking about originally. Like, it's just people who've kind of left this space and then they go over to this space, BJJ, boxing or whatever, and then they still want to make money out of this. So they say, well, I use my principles in this thing, which is not illegitimate as an argument. It just begs the question, like, was it worth spending all that time doing all of that if you wanted to do, if you can do that? Because the boxing and MMA people can do it, and usually they can do it better anyway, because they didn't waste any time doing all of this. So what's the point? What's valuable? You know, I should say amongst all this, obviously I do think there is things that are valuable. You know, it's like how we get to them, how we teach them, how we encourage them, and how we improve them in the future, so we don't fall afoul of all of these different problems. Now, Wang Shenjai didn't train like that. So Wang Shenjai trained very much through kind of process of intuition and long-term development. You know, Yao Zhongzong, for example, tells us about how he changed his mind about loads of things. Now he had to practice. Han Xingqiao tells us about how much innovation that he did, and that people really, that's the one thing they really hated, that he innovated. And other people, Han Sihuang, Yang Demo, they tell us a lot about, you know, Wang Shenjai just like being a very creative, he was an odd person. People who see things very differently are very odd, as I know, and seem very odd to other people. There's no way around that. If you're creative, you're usually quite odd, because you see the world differently. That's what helps you innovate. You see the world differently to everyone else. And very often, because you don't fit in, eventually you just think, well, sod it, I'll be the hated one. I'll be the hated one. I'll just, you know, just out of sheer bloody mindedness, I'll oppose everything that you're doing and look at it completely differently and create a different way of doing it and piss everyone off. You know, that's what Wang Shenjai thought. That's how I think. So Zhao Daoxin, Wang Shenjai's, you know, student, he says, they're the best people, they're the people we want in Yiquan. He talks about how ossified structures repress innovation, radicalism, people who want to just like challenge the nonsense and think in a contradictory way. And this is one of the problems, I have to say, with the Yiquan as it's developed, as it's become that ossified system. It's become impossible to be radical. When's the last time anyone radically changed anything? And when they do, that then becomes the new stifling orthodoxy. And so anyway, that's the problem, isn't it? So it's well discussed amongst Wang Shenjai's own students that Wang Shenjai wasn't a very good teacher. You know, and that's often the case, that someone's like a radical innovator, but they're not necessarily a great teacher. But part of the problem that Wang Shenjai had was that he didn't follow any kind of orthodox system, and he hardly even trained with Guo Yunshen. That's like, you know, Yiquan's origin myth. Of course, he did train with him as a child, but how much he could have learned is very much open to question. And although that's very often used to attack Yiquan by these reactionaries who think until you've completely retarded your mind by learning Xing Yiquan, you can't then learn Yiquan. You've got to go backwards and learn Xing Yiquan. Well, I think actually it was a massive positive that Wang Shenjai didn't really learn Xing Yiquan from Guo Yunshen. It's a massive positive. He wasn't, like Wang Shenjai says, bound foot grows the least. Like, it's like those, like I'm saying, the guys who are doing loads of forms to get really great at push hands. If you cut all of that out, you've got more time to spend developing stuff that actually functions. Then you don't have to keep putting out videos like certain Xing Yiquan people talking about, well, Xing is about more than fighting, you know, but it should at least be about fighting. You know, and I'm not saying it's not, I'm saying it at one time it was, but things move on. And well, anyway, there's another dimension to that actually, so this is also important. And this is why not only did Wang Shenjai not follow the 7 stages of Yiquan, neither did any of his students. So all of his students, for the most part, were significantly good level in other kinds of Chinese martial arts before they began training with him. And that's like, it's an element of Yiquan that isn't considered in the 7 stages of Yiquan model. Where is that? So apart from Wang Shenjai himself, who probably didn't learn that much Xing Yiquan, But it's a different thing because he's a radical innovator and he's got a very creative mind, and not everyone quite has that in the same way. But once someone's done that, and the idea is that it's not just innovation, it's unfolding things that are true. So it's seeing things that are true about how the human body functions, things that make sense, that are true. Apologies, I'm going to suck on a cough sweet and talk because I do suffer a lot with bad throats. It's an indication of very strong fiery qi in old Chinese medicine. Now we call it a hiatus hernia. And Barrett's esophagus, you get your stomach acid damage, the back of your throat got that really bad. It's one of the reasons why I need to do, if I'm going to tell people what I think and what I know, I need to do it now before I lose my voice. What could the Almighty be trying to tell me by silencing me from speaking? So it's one of the things like maybe, it's one of the things Wang Shenjai missed, I'm going to say. So let's ask a question, right? Why did Han Xing Xiao and Han Xing Yuan continue to teach Xing Yiquan? They're exposed to Wang Shenjai, they can see his level, it's a conceptual revolution, they continue to teach Xing Yiquan. There can be more than one answer to that, I know that. Someone who's a former Taolu athlete and I still like doing forms, there's actually lots of benefits in doing forms. So Wang Shenjai's very militant stance on that. I think there's a bit of bloody-mindedness in that, to be honest, that he didn't really learn that many forms. He was always being criticised by people who did forms and nothing else, so he's kind of been bloody-minded and gone the other way. But I know there's a big conceptual reason that makes sense that he's talking about, like, why spend all this time doing forms when you could spend it, doing practical training? There's an answer to that question. That's the key point. That gives you a structure. It gives you an understanding and knowledge of structure and the way that structure functions. It gives you a skeletal basis upon which to flesh out the Yiquan method, which is otherwise quite abstract and hard, and it's a practical platform. So you've got to be able to do it practically, and to do that, the so-called 7 stages of Yiquan doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's all right, just moving your arms about in the air and then having some very staged demos and things like that. That's not enough on its own, because each one's a dialectical interaction between quintessence movement skills and fight training. And this element of fight training here means you need some kind of basis, some kind of skeletal platform that this can be applied to, that it can flesh out this. And this is why, for example, Wang Shenjai students could get it so much more easily. I know there's the odd case of somebody who trained with him from 7 years old, but still all of those people nevertheless are being exposed to other things like Xing Yiquan and, in Yao Zhongzhen's case, Western boxing, so other people, Bagua. They've got different bases in different things, wrestling, Shui Jiao, and so on. They've got this structure. It's the missing piece of Yiquan. It's the missing piece. That's why they retain it, because this is how they all learned. This is why they could do it. They were already high level in something that had given them a skeletal structure. Then the danger here is, people kind of get this, mostly outside of Yiquan. People get this in Chinese martial arts. So then you've got this other kind of reactionary thing where it's like, yeah, but Yiquan's just like an essence of Wushu. It's like, no. Yiquan's like an essence, so you can do Xing Yiquan and find the essence. No. Yiquan's an essence, so you can do Bagua and the essence, you find the essence through that. No, that's not the idea. Xing Yiquan, Bagua, they're all based on the essence, the quintessence movement principles of wushu. They're all there in different degrees. They're not necessarily all there in every art because of the way that the different arts function. Certain quintessence movement principles about linear force and bone alignment in Xing Yiquan aren't there anywhere near there in Bagua, apart from a very odd posture here and there. Xing Yiquan doesn't have the kind of use of musculature and flowing guiding force that Bagua has, nowhere near. So they're not all there in every art. This is why it's like a jigsaw. So Wang Xian tries putting the jigsaw together. There's different quintessence movement principles, just like the first emperor uniting China, bringing these things back together into our arts, the arts that is the foundation art of the human species. That's based on quintessence movement principles, explored and developed and trained through Chinese culture. So you don't just get that through practicing Xing Yiquan or Bagua, or indeed even the 7 stages of Yiquan. So it's a reactionary misunderstanding to think if you just train Bagua, it'll take you to the same place, for the very simple reason that Yiquan's a dialectic between fight training and quintessence movement principles. Bagua is a dialectic between quintessence movement principles and the structure of Bagua. Tai Chi is a dialectic between quintessence movement principles and the structure of Tai Chi. Xing Yiquan, dialectic between quintessence movement principles and the structure of Xing Yiquan. Everything, in every case, that comes up against the boundary that I talked about at the beginning, where you reach the limitations of that art and then you're faced with this conundrum. How do I, like in the best case scenario, when you become like absolutely top level, you achieve the actual, the maximum top level in those arts. You're like the best that's ever been in Tai Chi, Bagua, Xingyi. Nevertheless, you reach the limitation of that art where you have to somehow innovate and go beyond. And then the question is, like, once you've done that, is it still Xingyi? It's something else. And well, there's lots of people who never even get that far before they start deviating. It's a very common thing now for people to teach multiple different arts, because it's the Jeet Kune Do reaction, like thinking that what it is that you're searching for is in a different, like I haven't found it here, so it must be somewhere, it must be in another art, so I'll go and learn another art, and another art, and another art. Talk about that another time. And there's this other reactionary thing where people think, like, you have to learn Xing Yiquan. You have to learn Xing Yiquan before you can understand Yiquan. You have to go back. Why go backwards? Why go backwards? We've already transcended the limitations of it. We've taken what's valuable. We've transcended the limitations of that. We've already assumed we've reached that point. Even the highest level masters of Xing Yiquan have reached that point and they're at the boundaries. So why would we want to go back and put ourselves in another prison? And this is like one of the key magical insights of each one, that each one of these things is a prison. And you can dig your way to another prison and dig it out. Here's Bagua. Reach the limits, dig out a tunnel to another prison, that's Xing Yiquan. Dig out a prison to another, that's Tai Chi. Now you've got 3 big cells in your prison, but it's still prison. And what Wang Xianjia is trying to get across is all of these prisons are in your mind. I mean, they're physical concepts, the boundary of the movement. It's like when we do Yiquan and we do a lock point, that's in your mind. The mind, the intent creates that lock point. When you do a form, that's in your mind. It's like a mold of movement that's in your mind. It's recognizing, it's making the abstract leap to wake up from this prison. You can make this prison as big as you want and you can go full circle. This is what this reactionary thing where people go like, well, now I'm doing BJJ and now I'm applying Bagua principles to BJJ. They've just dug the prison cells in a circle and come back to the beginning. Still not. It's still not what Wang Shenjia is talking about. You're still within the prison. You can just then you can just push the boundaries of your Bagua a little bit further out, because now you're adding in some BJJ. And if you're in the Chinese martial arts world, you know the kind of people I'm talking about. You know that this has happened. And it's not a criticism of them. Like, in many cases, their level is outstanding, but it's still not what Wang Shenjia is talking about. It's not. There's something more. There's something more important. The thing that really matters, recognizing that these are mental. These are intuitive creations. The mold of the movement for Tai Chi, for Bagua, is in your mind. It's in your mind. Just like the lock point. Intent controls that. And this physical form that is your body, intent does that. The abstract leap to recognise you don't need to go back, you don't need to keep building these prison cells. What you need to do is wake up. Wake up from this dream that this is freedom. Wake up from... So yes, you can wake up from Xing Yiquan, but you don't have to learn Xing Yiquan to learn Yiquan. You don't have to go backwards to go forwards. It's amazing how people think that. But the reason why, Han Xingqiao and Han Xingyuan continue to teach Xing Yiquan is that without it, there isn't the framework there for Yiquan to really work. It needs some kind of framework, and everyone recognised that. And everyone after Wang Shenjia's death recognised Wang Shenjia wasn't a great teacher. His method didn't really work, and it certainly didn't work for what Wang Shenjia wanted, which was like, how do we cut out all of this forms training, traditional wushu, get the essence, and then we'll take someone from scratch, kind of blank slate, if you like, and we train them and we build them up. It doesn't work. Wang Shenjia didn't train like that. None of his students trained like that. They all had some kind of structure that it functioned around. And if they didn't, they were soon influenced by others of his students who did have that structure, because that's where techniques start emerging from. Once you've actually got to think about, how do I punch someone in the face, that's a technique, then you start talking about, well, do we use Xing Yiquan, do we use Western boxing, what do we use? Do we use something from Bagua? These are all structures that are the skeleton that we put the flesh on. And then it's just a discussion about, these are what we call cultural sets. So we've talked about this idea before of the natural set. Not that there really is anything that we can call a natural set, because nothing's natural, it's all partly cultural, everything's a contradiction. But there certainly are cultural sets, like Xing Yiquan is a cultural set, Western boxing is a cultural set. The skeletal structure that you put the flesh of Yiquan on and make it function. How do I get my fist over there? I've got all the quintessence movement skills. How do I make it work? Most people, I have to say, are locked in a fantasy about that, and we call it the prior force fallacy. And it's another problem with the 7 stages of Yiquan method. If you think like you do standing, and then it'll give you some kind of force that will then work when eventually you make it through to doing Sanshao, that's the prior force fallacy. If you think that Hun Yuan Li somehow exists without diligent, consistent fight training and practice, it's the prior force fallacy. If you think that comes before, you've got to be careful about this, because what Wang Shenjia is talking about is developing certain physical qualities, and all martial arts do that. If it's just as basic as fitness, toughness, flexibility and strength, they could be like prior qualities that you develop and then build on. Hun Yuan Li is just like that. It's a prior way of physically using the body and training the intent, so that, like I've talked about before, you can think about it like improving your talents, because it improves the connection to your whole body. That then needs a structure, and it's got to be trained hand in hand or in harmony, intent with body, quintessence movement principles with fight training and practice. Zhao Daoxin says it's the most stupid thing in martial arts to think that you can just do standing and then somehow you'll just be able to do Sanshao. Han Si Huang also says people who think you just do standing and that's going to teach you how to fight, Like, it's so obviously stupid. You can't believe that people believe that, but they do believe that. That's why no one can do it. No one can do it. And that's why the 7 stages of Yiquan on their own don't work. And then that's why people fake it. And it's why, if they don't fake it, they just do very staged demonstrations, or they do this other kind of reactionary thing where they just do boxing or kickboxing, BJJ, and they say, I use the principles, you know. Or I saw another Yiquanese so-called saying, Yiquan principles are invisible. You can't see them. Well, that's great. Oh, that's wonderful. It's like, you know, we're properly in the territory of the emperor's new clothes, aren't we? Like, only those who are educated enough can see the Yiquan principles at work. As Zhao Daoxin says, I can see it when you punch a bag. You know, I can see if you've got real power when you punch a bag. So you never see him punching a bag hardly. And it's not just about punching a bag anyway or a pad, it's about the quintessence principles of Wushu. Can you say, this is why you should do this training? Otherwise, why would I do that? You know, like a boxer can do that and can do it better. So why would I do that? You know, what is there about Chinese Wushu that you're doing that's different? Oh, it's invisible. Is it? Well, what's the point then? You know, how stupid do you think? Go and get counselling. Go on, another one. Go and get counselling. How stupid do you think we are? So, you need that structure. You need that structure. And you've got to think about that. Actually, you've got to abolish this idea of the 7 stages of Yiquan. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. But everyone's on the right lines, like Han Xing Xiao, Han Xing Yuan. They're on the right lines. You need some kind of structure to it. Then it's an argument about, well, which structure is best, which cultural set is the best to use. So between Xing Yiquan and Western boxing, which is the best? You know, that's a debate you can have, and that's a technical debate. And people, again, it becomes a pathological thing where if you're in one camp or the other, you start like hating other people. You know, we're supposed to be in the same kind of Yiquan revolution, but you start hating this faction of the revolution because of this deviation, this ideological impurity. People talk about it like purity. Our Yiquan is pure. It's pure. No Yiquan is pure. Wang Xiaojai he just made it up. He made it up, or he developed it intuitively. You know, that's how I think about it. He unfolded things that are true due to his native genius and circumstances of his life, and the way people treated him, pushed him in a certain direction where he just unfolded this thing, works it out, that's true, or the beginnings of it. It's up to us to, you know, bring it into the modern world. You need a structure of some kind. Is it Xing Yiquan? Is it Western boxing? Actually, I think both. That argument's been overtaken. So this completely artificial factional thing between so-called Han's Yiquan, so-called Yao's Yiquan, I don't buy into any of that. No, you know, like Western boxing is impure, and using this religious language of purity, like it's impure. Western boxing is impure, it pollutes the Chinese, you know. Again, completely contradicts Wang Xiaojai's teaching. He says, you know, Western, Eastern, doesn't matter what it is, it's true or not true, it's right or wrong, you know, like, it's not about purity. I'm not tickling you, Tubby, on camera. Aren't you ashamed to be seen like that? It's a scientific question, which is, you know, and Yao Zhongzhun tries to address this, you know, like the shape of Western boxing is scientifically more appropriate than for example Xing Yiquan. It's, you know, it's than other kinds of Chinese martial arts. It's just scientifically more appropriate for a more modern world. Actually, I think both of those have been surpassed, and things that happen in MMA indicate that, well, you know, there's radical upgrades in that need to be thought about in terms of what is the structural basis that we base this basis. There's no reason. Xing Yiquan was just made up. You know, it's made up around principles, but it was just made up, and it's got limitations. Western boxing's got limitations. MMA's got limitations. Then we have this other reactionary thing where people say, yeah, but it's about street fighting or something like that, and you just kind of dragged back. You dragged back into the kind of Jeet Kune Do, Krav Maga, reactionary deviation from the truth, because it's about quintessence movement principles. You start getting dragged back into the fallacy of techniques, that it's about techniques, and you start just, if you say it's about street fighting, then you just start thinking about what works in a street fight, and it's like, well, why street fight? Why not domestic violence? Why pick that? Why pick anything? But that's why, like, we use this idea of the doctrine of the mean, and I've talked about before, where you don't think about a street fight. What you think about, first of all, is kind of like a no rules, no gloves fight. And then that's the kind of structural basis, but it's still not enough of a structure on its own to make each one function, to make it work. Whereas something like MMA really is, and then from that you can think about self-defense, you can think about sport, you can go on from that. And this is quite an abstract concept, you have to say, to think about what is this eighth part of each one, what's missing, the structure, that wasn't actually missing with Wang Shenjai's students. They all had it from a different art. What should that look like? What should it be like? That's a whole different question, but it has to be something. And that's something that we can work towards. That's something that we can explore and try and understand, recognizing it's time specific, like what Zhao Daoxin kind of gets at as the fallacy of the cave. If you're locked in a cave in Tibet for 20 years, you don't know what's going on in the wider world. So no matter how good your quintessence movement principles are, they're not going to be keeping up with. If everything else is evolving, you're not going to keep up. If you've been in a cave, if you'd learnt BJJ and then went into a cave 20 years ago, 20 years ago you might have won the UFC, but you come out of your cave now and try and win the UFC with just BJJ, it's not going to happen. It's deeply unlikely to happen. It's the fallacy of the cave, thinking that there's, a wushu master in a cave somewhere who's got these timeless quintessence movement principles. No, it evolves over time. It evolves. And that's part of how we define each one, not as a style. Define it not even in just one way, but one of the ways we define it as a social process that's occurring over time. Then we can think about developing, this is what, the kind of stuff that I'm doing, developing this baseline structure, this eighth part, but actually, as part of that process, erasing this idea of the 7 steps of each one, which doesn't work anyway. It's got to be a holistic. You're better off thinking of the 2 parts of each one, quintessence movement principles and practical fight training and practice. That's exactly how Wang Shenjai trained. This fight training and practice has got to include that 8th part, the structure, which is something that we can use a cultural set, or we can adapt a cultural set. We can adapt something like MMA to play that role. You can use Xing Yiquan, you can use Western boxing, then you can argue about which one's better. But argue scientifically, don't argue. Like Wang Shenjai himself says, there's a benefit to being in a group, but it's ridiculous how people start hating each other based on doctrinal differences. Each one people are the worst for that. Think about each one as having 2 parts, not 7, and liberate yourself. And then, like Zhao Daoxin says, the fight training's got to be integrated. Well, actually, Wang Shenjai says it, all your training's got to be linked as closely as possible to the reality of the fight. And Yao Zongzun says that as well. Linking those 2 together. And through that engine of the 2 parts of each one, that engine is infinitely creative, infinitely. And it's time-proofed, so things change in the future. Who could have seen, the development of MMA? Well, Zhao Daoxin did. But the way it's developed, there'll be new developments. This method is time-proofed. It can adapt and change, because it's yin-yang, it's the essence of the Tao itself. And how infinitely creative, potentially, that is. And creating people like that. There's loads of more ideas we could explore, but that's what I wanted to talk about today. That 7 stages of each one idea is bobbins. It is bobbins. Let it go. It doesn't work. It's never worked. Anyone who's even achieved any kind of competence in each one, demonstrable competence didn't follow that stage. Even if they think they did, they didn't. Everyone's used some kind of structure, and those that didn't just didn't get there. So, and in any case, it leads to the prior force fallacy. It stops you doing fight training and practice integrated holistically with the system. Everyone knows it doesn't work. Even Han Xing Chao's sons, Han Xing Chao is probably the most orthodox and faithful replicator of Wang Shangjai's method. Even Han Xing Chao's sons abandoned that method. Whether they created something better or not isn't, it's a discussion for another time. But everyone kind of abandoned that method. And even if you look at Han Xing Yuan, Han Xing Yuan continues to teach Xing Yiquan. Ask yourself why. Why did he continue to do that? And so that's it. A little bit of dojo chat anyway. Bit of a conceptual upgrade, or at least an upgrade into how I think about it. A bit of a radical. It's good. Be radical. Challenge. Think differently. Recognise the true vision of each one. Why it's totally different from everything else. To create these independent-minded, radical thinkers, not just keep creating new orthodoxies. That's why Yao Zongzun innovates from Wang Shangjai, Han Xing Yuan innovates from Wang Shangjai. They become the new orthodoxy that you can't deviate from. That's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. People have lost their way if they think like that. Independent, creative people rebel against the feudalism that's infected it all. Reclaim the revolution. Hey, one love. I'll see you in the next one. How dare you lick my salute? What a good boy.